All right, World History Discussions on Chapter 3. This is part 3 of the discussions on ancient Egypt and its connection to the rest of the world. So now we're going to get to the timeline here. About 10,000 BCE, the Sahara was a savanna land with grasses and lakes. And then you have the origins of Sudanic herding in about 9,000 BCE and the first agriculture in Sudan in 7500 BCE. And so then, before we get into Egypt, I got to talk about the Sudan. First of all, there are some people, largely black nationalists, that will claim that ancient Egyptians were black and not Arabs. And I'm actually going to entertain that theory. I don't know if it's true or not, but most of the people in Egypt probably did come from Sudan. This is the country of Sudan, but the Sudan region is all in here. And it's 4,000 miles long. As you can see, it's as big as the United States, a little bit bigger than the United States, east to west, stretching all the way from Western Sahara to modern Sudan. And it's this region that's kind of the borderland between the forests of sub-Saharan Africa and the intense deserts of the Sahara in northern Africa. But as I said, about 10,000 BCE, the Sahara was more like what the lands in here are like in the Sudan. It was a little bit wetter and not quite as hot. And there were all these lakes in here, and there were all these people that settled in here. But after about 5,000 BCE, the Sahara got much hotter, much drier, much more like what we know it as today. And people were forced over to the areas around Lake Chad and the Great Lakes of East Africa, like Lake Victoria and Tanganyika, and of course, into the Nile Valley, such as modern Sudan and eventually Egypt. And as I said, Egypt is at a major crossroads in world geography, much like the area we talked about in the last chapter of Mesopotamia, which is a big crossroads between Africa, Asia, and Europe. Egypt's at a big crossroads between the Mediterranean. So much what we know about Egypt comes from the Greeks, and the Levant and the Near East. When we get into the New Kingdom, you'll see that they bump right up against the Hittite Empire, but they also went south into Kush. And so people talk a lot less, because our world history is very Eurocentric and Eurasia-centric. People talk a lot less about Egypt's connections down south into sub-Saharan Africa and upriver. Kingdom of Kush, which I promise we're going to get into in this very timeline, and further south. But basically, Sudanese cultivators were thought to come into Egypt, and it was thought that Upper Egypt in 3100 BCE conquered Lower Egypt. So it seems that the civilization spread this way. How do we know that the civilization was not black Africans from down here, rather than the Arab population that it is today that makes it more like this Middle Eastern region? Anyway, just a cool thought. But around 3100 BCE, Upper Egypt conquers Lower Egypt and is unified under King Menes. Around that same era, around 3200 BCE, that writing first starts, probably diffused from cuneiform in Mesopotamia over to hieroglyphs in Egypt. So now I'm going to go back to the timeline, because Egypt has some major periods. And don't forget this timeline. So the first you get, they call it early dynastic, and I call it the archaic period, before you get into the Egyptian Old Kingdom. So basically, the archaic period's from about 3100 to 2600 BCE. And then you get the first kingdom of Kush during the Egyptian Old and Middle Kingdom. We're going to get into that in a minute, but the Old Kingdom is from about 2660 to 2160 BCE, and this is the era of the pyramids. Pyramids were mostly being built between 2600 and 2500 BCE. So right around the same era, the early Kingdom of Kush, with a capital at Kerma, 435 miles south of Aswan, formed. So just again, keep in mind how big this region is. 665 miles in Egypt, and then another 435 miles to Kerma. Like I say, when we get to Meroe, that's 1,000 miles upriver from Aswan. So this is a huge, huge region. When you're talking that much distance, I mean, that's like the distance of Greenville, South Carolina to Washington, D.C. This is no small distance to get from Aswan to Kerma. By the way, I thought I'd clear something else up. Nubia is not a country, it's a region. But Kush is the country that dominated the region of Nubia. But the Egyptian Old Kingdom lasted about 500 years. By the way, you're thinking, oh, that's just a blip in Egyptian history, and it is, but the United States has not been around for nearly that long. Think about it. This is where we go back into how big is time. I mean, 500 years ago, it was 1526. Jamestown's founding was still 81 years into the future, just for context. But the Egyptian Old Kingdom lasted from 2660 to 2160 BCE, with the pyramids being built about 2600 to 2500 BCE. And we're going to get into the pyramids later. But I thought I'd also mention something kind of cool, which is that the next chapter we'll be discussing is the Indus. And the Indus was at its height around 2500 BC and then just mysteriously just disappeared in modern Pakistan, what they call ancient India. And here's the Egyptian Old Kingdom at its height. 2500 BCE seemed to be a very high time period all around the world. Ancient aliens, anybody? But yeah, that's when the pyramids were mostly built. And then we talked about the 2200 BCE and the 100-year drought that ended so many civilizations. No exception, it ended the Egyptian Old Kingdom. You had this big intermediate period before you get into the Egyptian Middle Kingdom. And the Egyptian Middle Kingdom lasted from about 2050 to 1674 BCE. Not much to remember about the Middle Kingdom until you get to 1674 BCE, which was a major turning point in Egypt's history. And so now I'm going to go back over to the other map. I love these maps and images. So you probably learned in school that one big advantage of Egypt is that compared to Mesopotamia, Egypt was isolated. Well, that's true for the first nearly 2,000 years of Egypt's history, but that all ends in 1674 BCE when the Hyksos from somewhere in the Middle East come in and they invade Egypt and they smash up, not Thebes, they smash up Memphis, because Memphis was the capital of Lower Egypt, Thebes the capital of Upper Egypt. So they smash up Memphis and they invade Egypt with their armies, and their big advantage is bronze weaponry. Iron had not really been diffused yet. The Hittites were using iron, but they hadn't even gotten super powerful yet. But interestingly enough, 1674 BCE, Hyksos invasion, and then less than 100 years later, 1595 BC, Hittites sack Babylon. Just kind of cool. They're close together on the timeline, well, less than 100 years apart, and they're major invasions. But now